Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Wildlands for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a tactical third-person shooter, although the camera perspective does switch over to first-person when you go to aim at things. And it was developed by Ubisoft Paris and Ubisoft Milan and released in 2017 for PC, Xbox One, and PS4, to a mixed to generally positive reception. A lot of people really like the co-op in particular, although the game did have some pretty nasty technical issues on launch that they have mostly ironed out by this point. It's also a bit of a departure from the direction that the series had gone as of Advanced Warfighter, where it had gone increasingly further into futuristic stuff, with things getting positively ridiculous by the time you get to Future Soldier, but Ghost Recon Wildlands decided to take things back to a more modern setting, something that's a lot more grounded, although it does have its fair share of ridiculousness, such as the tie-in mission with the Predator franchise, which is a pretty odd choice for a supposedly fairly realistic tactical shooter. Especially one that, for the most part, actually takes itself extremely seriously, even though a lot of the gameplay gets in the way of that, but that's something I'll get to more later on. Thankfully, the other tie-in missions made a lot more sense. One of them just ties the story in this to the story in the sequel to this, which is Breakpoint, and then another one introduces some characters from Rainbow Six Siege and has you go on a bit of an adventure with them, and another one introduces Sam Fisher and you go on a stealth mission with him. And it's incredibly annoying because it's yet another instance of Sam Fisher being shoehorned into a game that is not a Splinter Cell game, and us not having gotten a Splinter Cell game since 2013. Anyway, as far as Wildlands itself goes, those of you who've been watching my channel for a while know that I actually did cover the closed beta of this back in 2017 along with the Ghost War PvP mode, but I haven't gotten around to reviewing the game proper yet. Well, that changes with this particular video, so let's go ahead and start delving right into this and find out what exactly we're dealing with here, how well it holds up after several years of development and patching and such, and of course, how it is compared to previous Ghost Recon games. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with presentation, which is a very mixed bag overall. The graphics range from absolutely stunning in the case of all the environmental art, where Ubisoft's environmental artists went completely out of their way to make an absolutely gorgeous, meticulously detailed Bolivia. And given how large the game world is, you'll have plenty of time to wander around it and take in all the sights, and that definitely does not disappoint, although there is a bit of an issue with that I'll get to more when I get to the gameplay. Now, in addition to the environments themselves looking fantastic, the game also has a rather long draw distance, which means that you can see a lot of that detail for a fairly long distance. Now, so far the presentation's probably sounding pretty good, and it's also going to sound really good when you start to look at the actual weapons and go into the weapon customization, where it pulls all the weapons apart into a bunch of different components, and they are all meticulously detailed, and that all looks fantastic, which is actually a feature that was brought over from Future Soldier, and was actually one of the very few good things about that game. But once you look past the environments and the weapon modeling, you start to run into some pretty nasty problems. I mean, sure, it does have rather high quality textures that do for the most part look pretty good, but then there's the characters, which look pretty bad, because their models make them look like they came out of the previous gen of consoles, and the lip sync is absolutely terrible. And it's not even just limited to the lip sync either. The character animations in general just look stiff and awkward, with some very odd and very quick animations that make it look like they were made for expediency rather than quality. In fact, it can be downright jarring when you go from being in a vehicle and driving or flying around the Bolivian landscape and really taking in all these gorgeous landscapes, and then you get down on the ground and start running around and look at your character, or it plays a cutscene and your character is talking with another one, and immediately the quality level seems to go down almost an entire console generation. It's just bizarre. And it certainly doesn't help that the performance is wildly inconsistent. There are numerous areas where it will be well above 60 FPS, sometimes even above 80 FPS, and then other times it'll be well below even 30 FPS. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of rhyme or reason to it. I mean, you would expect areas that are very densely populated to not run as well, but sometimes they do, and then other times they don't. I've also run into some issues where if I've had the game running for longer than maybe an hour or so, then it starts to really slow down to a crawl and have a lot of hitching issues where it's having really hard time loading things in, and while it is loading objects in, it'll have the frame rate tank down below even 20 FPS, which just gets downright unplayable. Although that usually only lasts for a couple of seconds while it is loading those things in, and once it has loaded them in, then it's fine after that, but it's still a massive problem with wildly inconsistent performance across the board. So that unfortunately makes the visuals a pretty mixed bag, but then you go over into sound design and things are thankfully a lot more consistent. The sound effects are generally solid enough, they definitely get the job done, although the gun and explosion sounds are a bit on the weaker side, unfortunately. They do have some nice environmental effects applied to them, but there's not really much bass kick behind them, so you never really feel like you're shooting a bunch of powerful weapons, nor do you feel like your explosions are really doing anywhere near as much damage as they're actually doing. It's got a solid soundtrack with a pretty good amount of variety to it, with some tracks that are a bit more low-key for the quieter moments in the game, as well as tracks that kick in the more rock guitar when the action heats up, and it all features a lot of Latin stylings, which makes it very fitting for the setting. And then of course there's the voice acting, which is a mixture of Spanish and English, and while some of the American characters speaking Spanish sound pretty ridiculous, the characters whose native language would be Spanish sound a lot more convincing. That said, it is hard to ignore that a lot of the voice acting in general just comes across as very stilted and awkward, particularly with the main character that you play as, who just says a bunch of odd phrases and never really seems to have anywhere near as much emotion as you might think they would have in certain situations. I mean, to give you a prime example, one of the weirder turns of phrase that the main character has is saying shitballs whenever there's a bunch of heavy fire coming their way, and it's not even said with any urgency or proper oh shit value, it's just shitballs. As if the situation is super casual and this is just a mild inconvenience at absolute worst. Like, oh gosh golly darn, I left my keys on the table. Only instead of leaving your keys on the table, it's, oh gosh golly darn, I'm being shot at with a 20mm autocannon. It's things like that that really take you out of the experience, and what is meant to be a very serious story with some very heavy subject matter ultimately ends up being something you have a hard time giving much of a crap about, because the dialogue is just not all that well written, and it's certainly not very well acted. So the sound design is also a bit of a mixed bag, but it's a lot more consistent in its quality than the visuals can be, because even though the voice acting is not very good, it's not very good across the entire game, not just certain characters are really well voiced and others aren't, although when you combine it with a lot of the visual issues, it does end up making the presentation a bit of a mess. But as messy as the presentation can be, what really matter are the story and the gameplay. The story in this takes place in a fictionalized version of 2019, where the country of Bolivia has been taken over by the fictional drug cartel Santa Blanca, which then proceeded to turn the entire country into a narco state that is effectively run by the cartel alone. Even though there is technically a government and a military, they are both highly corrupt and more often than not will leave the cartel to its own devices unless their hand is forced. For example, the cartel opens fire on Unidad, which is the military force of the country. The player is thrown into this grim scenario as the leader of a squad of ghosts. These are ultra-elite, super secretive special forces from the US that have been dropped into the country to completely destabilize the cartel and ultimately take down its leader, El Sueño. You'll be working alongside a local rebel faction, which will grow in strength as you continue to dismantle cartel operations and gather more resources for the rebels, although this doesn't really have much of an effect on the story as much as it affects the gameplay, but that's something I'll get to more in a moment. As I mentioned, you are the leader of a squad of ghosts, which means that you do have a selection of operators that will accompany you throughout the entire campaign, but you shouldn't really expect much out of them in terms of character because they're all basically cardboard cutouts at absolute best, and that's not really all that surprising given that they're basically just placeholders for what they intended for you to be playing with, which is other players. You see, it is painfully obvious from the very moment you start the game up and start messing around with things that the game is intended to be played in 4-player co-op and not in single player like I ended up playing through it, because barely anybody I know even has this game, and more importantly, if they do have it, they're not willing to install all 70 gigabytes of it just so they can play co-op with me. This meant that the entire time I was playing the game, I was playing with the AI squad mates, and I was constantly being assailed by their complete lack of personality and their complete lack of anything interesting to add to the entire experience, other than simply being a gameplay mechanic in terms of the sync shot and being able to revive me when I'm downed. Again, this isn't necessarily all that surprising given that the game is meant to be played in 4-player co-op and not in single-player, so the AI squad mates you get in single-player are just placeholders, basically. But if you do end up playing through the game single-player, that is a pretty nasty detriment. And unfortunately, the rest of the game's cast of characters is not really all that interesting either. El Sueño himself is just completely over the top and ridiculous, and all of his underbosses and lieutenants and such are fairly ridiculous themselves. And while that wouldn't necessarily be a problem if this was a game like, say, Saints Row or something like that, this is a game that takes itself extremely seriously to the point where it's downright comical at times, just how gritty it's acting like it is, when in reality it's just silly and ridiculous a lot of the time. I mean, you'd think with the extremely heavy subject matter this game tends to deal with that it would take itself seriously and it would make for a sort of gripping and dramatic narrative, but in reality it basically just serves as a context for all of the various side activities and missions that you're going to be taking part in. None of the characters get any sort of character development. In fact, they're not even given the chance, because the only times you're ever going to run into them are in the missions where you're going after those particular underbosses or lieutenants or whatever the case is. And in those missions, you go up, you find them, you either kill them or capture them or whatever the case may be, and that's it. You never hear from that character again. So at best, they get one rather brief cutscene where they actually get to do anything, and the rest of the time they're just in the background being this kind of menacing figure that you're ultimately trying to take down, on the way to taking an even more menacing figure down. Yeah, in case you can't tell by now, the story and characters are extremely weak. As I said, they're basically just set up for what you're actually going to be doing in the gameplay portions, and not much more than that. Which wouldn't necessarily be a problem if this game weren't so long. You see, the way the game is structured is that there are 21 provinces for you to wander around in the game, and each one, except for 2 of them, are headed by a member of the cartel that you ultimately need to take down. In order to take down one of these leaders, first you need to find major intel, which is scattered around the province and basically requires you to sneak into an area or go in guns blazing or whatever the case may be in any particular instance, and find a piece of intel that will lead you to a story mission. Once you complete enough story missions, then the final mission for that particular province will unlock, and you will be able to go on that mission and either capture, kill, or otherwise deal with the particular leader of that province, at which point the province will be considered liberated and the operations of the cartel in that province will be disrupted for the remainder of the game, although you will still have enemies wandering around the area. Each province has an overarching operation that it's attached to that once you complete enough of these provinces, then you will be able to take down the underboss for that particular operation, upon which point the operation is considered dismantled. Now, there are 4 of these operations. There's smuggling, production, security, and influence, and once you've taken down at least 2 of those operations, then you will be able to go after El Sueño himself. If you take down all 4 of them, then you unlock the alternate so-called good ending, but to get to at least an ending, you don't need to complete all of the provinces and dismantle all 4 of the operations. You only, again, need 2 of them. And the alternate ending you get if you dismantle all 4 of the operations is really not all that different from the ending you get if you don't dismantle all 4 of them, so you have to ask yourself, is it worth going through the game's 114 story missions in order to complete all of the provinces and take down all of the leaders and underbosses in order to get that very mildly different ending? Because to give you a rough estimate of how long that's going to take, it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 plus hours, which may sound like plenty of value for money. I mean, you get roughly 25 hours if you only go through the story missions that you need to in order to get to the end of the game, or you complete all of them and you end up with about 50 hours, and obviously if you do side activities, which there are a crap ton of, then you're going to extend your playtime even more. You're probably going to end up with good 70 to 100 hours plus, maybe. But something you need to understand before you go into something like this is that it's not necessarily the sheer amount of content that is important, it's how high quality that content is. And all of the missions in Ghost Recon Wildlands will fall into a handful of basic categories. Go to a location and take out a specific target. Go to a location and destroy some random object or vehicle. Go to a location and interrogate someone without being caught. Go to a location and defend a specific NPC or location. Or go to a location, find a specific vehicle, and take it back to some other place. And while the particulars might change a bit, you're ultimately going to be doing the same handful of things over and over and over again for all 114 of those story missions and however many side activities there are. I didn't count how many side activities there are, because it's at least the same amount as the number of story missions, but probably closer to twice that. And keep in mind, the map is absolutely gigantic, so when you are having to go between these different locations, it's going to take you a very long time. I lost count of the number of times it actually took me considerably less time to complete the mission than it did for me simply to get from wherever I started out to wherever the mission is. And more often than not, that was going from the nearest fast travel point to wherever this mission started. This means that a huge amount of your time in this game is going to be spent simply trying to get from point A to point B, which means that you're going to be having to constantly deal with all of the vehicles, which all handle like absolute garbage. The land vehicles all have very slippery controls, which makes it difficult to steer the vehicle without constantly ramming into things or jumping off of cliffs by accident or whatever the case may be. And way more often than not, the land route from getting where you are to where you need to be has you going over mountains or having to wind your way around various paths that if you don't go on them, you end up going off of a cliff and ending up dying and having to start the whole process over, and it ends up being an absolute mess. This means that wherever possible, you are going to immediately look for the nearest helicopter and jump into that and fly to wherever you need to go, because even though the helicopters also control like absolute garbage, at least they can fly over mountains and over the obstacles that would be in your way if you were in a land vehicle. There are also planes that you can hop into, but I highly recommend against doing that, even if you are looking into the side missions, which can give you a lot of resources, which is something I'll get to in a moment. Because the plane controls are the worst of the bunch. It is extremely difficult to actually turn them effectively without having them nosedive on you, so you're constantly having to circle around an area that you're trying to land, not because you're trying to actually slow down properly and follow an actual landing procedure like you would in a real aircraft. No, it's because the controls are so bad that in order to avoid crashing and having to start the entire damn thing over again, you are having to take things extremely carefully and are just going around in circles to slow down very gradually and eventually get just the right angle to where you're not going to crash and burn. And as if the controls weren't bad enough in all of the vehicles, and especially the flying vehicles, if you're in a flying vehicle, whether it's a helicopter or a plane, and you go anywhere near a location that has a missile turret, that will lock onto you and launch a missile at you, which you basically can't avoid, and for which there is absolutely no countermeasure other than simply trying to fly as low as you can, which will in turn get you shot at from the ground, of course. And if you somehow manage to avoid it, then you can continue on your merry way, only to probably run into more later on. And if you don't manage to avoid it, then congratulations, you're going to be starting that entire bit over again, only chances are this time you're not actually going to have the flying vehicle. It's just going to spawn you on the ground somewhere, which is incredibly obnoxious. So merely getting from where you start out, which is normally a fast travel point, to wherever your mission is a very long, tedious exercise, and then once you get there, then chances are what you're going to be doing is either going to be extremely short and not really worth the travel time, or it's just going to be even more traveling, in many cases a much longer distance. For example, if you get to one of the side missions or one of the missions that requires you to jump into a plane and fly it somewhere, it's going to be a very long distance that you need to travel. So you're going to be spending a good 10 or so minutes just flying from one point to another with terrible controls, not doing anything at all interesting. So you're going to learn pretty quickly to simply ignore any of the missions that require you to jump into a plane or a helicopter or a vehicle and drive it to some other location. Most of these being side missions that require you to do that for the sake of getting additional resources, which are used in tandem with skill points that you get both from finding them scattered around the world as pickup items, as well as just leveling up over time by just gaining experience from doing all manner of other tasks, in order to give yourself some additional equipment that you can use, as well as improving your capabilities, whether that be increasing your stamina and thus increasing the amount of time you can spend sprinting, or increasing the damage resistance of you and your squad mates against certain types of weaponry, or dealing increased damage against vehicles, or negating the damage penalty for using a suppressor, or whatever the case may be. And you'll require certain amounts of both skill points and resources in order to get these various skill upgrades, which means that progression in this game is an absolute grind of miserable proportions. Because you have only a handful of ways you can actually get resources. The first of them is the simplest, which is just finding resource caches around the world and marking them for retrieval, which will net you roughly 50 to 500 of a particular resource. The second and most generally lucrative way of getting the resources is to complete a bunch of side operations, which will usually have you driving a truck or flying a plane or a helicopter to a particular location. Those will normally net you about 1,000 to 2,000 of a given resource, although sometimes it does give you more. The thing is, those missions are also insanely boring. And then, of course, there are the actual story missions you can complete, some of which do give you resources, and some of which actually give you quite a lot of a given resource. But even with the fairly large amounts that some of those story missions can give you, they don't really give you enough to really matter all that much in the long run. You're going to have to complete an awful lot of missions in order to get the amount of resources that are going to be useful to you. So chances are you're going to end up in the ridiculous situation that I often found myself in, where I had upwards of 40 to 50 skill points or more, but nowhere near enough resources to actually get the skills I wanted to get. And since some of those skills are more or less mandatory, although the game will never admit that they're mandatory, things like the battery life and the range on the drone that you can fly around and mark things with, this obnoxious dependency on both resources and skill points can get downright frustrating. And as if that weren't enough of a grind, in order to find new weapons, you need to just wander around the world and find them in weapon crates, and then once you find those weapons, you'll find that you can't really do much in the way of customization, because in order to get all the weapon attachments, you have to do the same exact thing. You have to go and find a weapon case somewhere that has a specific attachment in it, and that attachment will only be for a specific weapon type and often a specific caliber. So you'll find a magazine type that is extended magazines for 9x19mm ammunition for submachine guns specifically, or it'll be an extended magazine for pistols specifically, or it'll be a laser sight that you can only mount to assault rifles, or a scope that you can only mount to sniper rifles, or whatever the case may be. And you'll end up just wandering around this massive world, finding all these crates, finding all these random attachments that you just can't really make much use of because you don't have the appropriate weapons to be able to use them. And in order to find these things in the first place, you're probably going to have to wander around and find either a lieutenant that you can grab and interrogate, or a piece of intel somewhere that will allow you to select an item to reveal on that particular province map. You can reveal where the skill points are, you can reveal where the weapon crates are, and you can reveal where the bonus medals are, bonus medals giving you an additional bonus to something. And you can also reveal where the rebel ops are and where the side missions are. The side missions are going to give you all these different resources, and the rebel ops are going to improve your capabilities with the rebel faction. So when you call into the rebels to get a mortar strike on a particular position, or to get some fighters as backup, then you'll be able to improve those capabilities by completing those rebel ops. And once you've gotten past all of that grind and all of that tedium and all of that basically bitch work, what do you actually get in terms of raw gameplay when you actually get into these missions and go around and try to take out enemies? Well, first you set up your loadout, which is going to consist of 2 primary weapons, which can be assault rifles, sniper rifles, machine guns, submachine guns, and so on. And you also get a sidearm, which is going to be a pistol or a machine pistol. And then you'll proceed to wherever your mission location is, and unless the mission specifically tells you that you cannot be detected or the mission will fail, which is always incredibly annoying, you will proceed to wipe out every single enemy in the location after having marked them all with your drone first. Because unless you're playing one of those missions that requires you to be undetected the entire time, there's really no reason not to wipe out every single enemy in the area. It will make your life a lot easier when you're going around and trying to do things. They do eventually throw a monkey wrench into the works by throwing in a few jammers here and there that will prevent you from being able to use the drone, which is incredibly annoying, but other than simply being annoying, it's really not that much of a hindrance because you also have binoculars that you can use to spot things with. It just takes you longer to scout things out, and then once you've scouted things out, then you can either just go in and start shooting things yourself, or you can mark targets for sync shots, which are shots that will occur all basically at the same time from your various squad mates, and you can have up to 3 of these at any given point, and you can either hold the button that you use to mark the targets in order to have your squad mates shoot at things, or you can shoot at a different enemy or one of those enemies yourself, and the squad mates will shoot at the same time. An enemy targeted by a sync shot will always drop in a single hit, no matter what, and while the other enemies that are around them can notice the enemy falling, chances are if you time everything right, then they're not going to notice it, and you're going to be able to mop things up very quickly. And that's pretty much it, actually. If you get headshots, you can pretty much instantly drop any enemy unless they're wearing a helmet, and even if they are wearing a helmet, if you're using a sniper rifle that is particularly high caliber, then it'll drop them in a single hit no matter where you hit them. There is some degree of ballistics simulation, so you'll have to deal with a bit of bullet drop, particularly at very long ranges with sniper rifles, but for the most part, the shooting mechanics in this are extremely simple, and outside of the sync shot, there's really no squad commands. You can either tell them to go into assault mode or stealth mode, and that's basically it. They'll just end up wandering around and doing things all on their own, and sometimes that will get you spotted, which is incredibly annoying when it happens, although thankfully it doesn't happen all that much. And in some cases, their AI will just glitch out entirely, and they'll just stand around doing absolutely nothing while you're laying on the ground bleeding out and just going, "Why the hell aren't you healing me?" Now you may be saying, but it sounds like they're an afterthought, and I've already said they're basically an afterthought. Remember how I mentioned before that this game was designed to be played in 4-player co-op and that the AI squad mates are just placeholders for other players? Well, that extends to the complete lack of squad commands other than sync shot and just assault or stealth mode, and it ends up making the squad mates basically useless. I mean, until you max out one of the skill trees, you aren't able to revive more than once per fight, so if you go down and your AI squad mate heals you that one time, then you better not die again, because if you do that, then you'll have to start from the last checkpoint. Meanwhile, in co-op, you can all heal each other whenever you want, and you're probably going to end up doing that all the time, because some idiot's going to throw a grenade somewhere by accident and take out half their team and have to go get everybody back up again, which is just silly, but also really annoying. But that sort of thing also makes the single player that much more frustrating, not just because the AI can only revive you once before you have to start over at the last checkpoint, but also because you really can't take a lot of damage in this. You'll get mowed down extremely quickly if you're not careful, so if you just blunder into something by accident and all of a sudden you're on the ground without even really knowing what's going on, and your AI squad mate comes up and heals you only to have you mowed down almost instantly again, then congratulations, you're starting over at the last checkpoint and you're not even entirely sure what you did wrong. This might force you into adopting a slower and more methodical playstyle in the single player, but here's the thing, people don't play this game that way in co-op. Co-op is full of everybody laughing their asses off as they just bumble around everything and play like complete morons, jump on the back of tractors and have tactical tractor assaults on enemy positions, and it just ends up being downright absurd. And sure, that can be fun, but that can be fun in just about any video game out there. And while you do have some very silly things you can do in this game, they're not really the way the game is meant to be played. Ubisoft clearly intended for everyone to take this game seriously, and when you go into co-op, the idea is that everybody will be doing mark and execute, and everybody will be synchronizing their movements, you'll be sneaking around and actually playing like special forces, but nobody plays Wildlands that way because the game itself does not facilitate that. You have basically no real tactical options. You just mark things, and then you take them out in whatever order you want. That's it. If you're with other players, you don't need to be tactical. You don't need to take things slow and methodical. You can just run in guns blazing and just get out of just about every situation without any problems. Meanwhile, if you try that in the single player, you're just going to get swarmed with enemies and mowed down almost instantly, and if you run into Unidad, then it gets particularly problematic because they have endlessly spawning enemies. And as you continue to take out their forces, they continue to escalate things, and you'll start running into a lot more helicopters, and they'll just roll in with a lot more armored vehicles, and it just gets downright absurd. And no matter how you look at this game, it is an absolute mess in every regard. The performance is all over the place, from being really good in some areas to really terrible in others. It's got fairly decent weapon handling mechanics, but because basically everything dies in a single headshot, they don't really matter. It's got stealth mechanics that mostly don't even function properly, where the enemy will either just not hear you properly, or they'll be oversensitive in the hearing, or they'll be able to spot you from half a mile away without you even being anywhere near their line of sight, whereas some other times you'll be really close to them and they somehow won't be able to see you, and it just doesn't make any sense. Whenever you run into Unidad forces, you have a very high likelihood of just running into instantly respawning enemies that you basically can't get away from, and ultimately having to just go until you die and have to start it over at a checkpoint. You have a skill system that becomes frustrating because you'll have an abundance of skill points and nowhere near enough resources to actually be able to get any of the skills. And then on top of all of this, the vast majority of what you're going to be doing in Wildlands is simply driving or flying from point A to point B, whether that being the main objective of whatever it is you're doing, or simply to get to your objective, which you'll then complete in about a fourth or less of the time that it took you to simply get there. As a tactical shooter, it is absolutely pathetic, and as a Ghost Recon game, frankly, it's downright insulting. And frankly, I am amazed. I thought this series couldn't get any worse than Ghost Recon Future Soldier, but as it turns out, at least Ghost Recon Future Soldier is a damn tactical shooter with squad commands, and at least it doesn't take maybe 5 hours worth of real unique content and stretch that out over maybe a 50 to 100 hour game depending on how much side content you do, and it doesn't repeat side activities over and over and over again just to pad out the length of the game, because all Wildlands ends up being is tons and tons of filler content that just drags on, and at best is boring, but at worst can be downright infuriating. I mean, sure, you can have some fun in co-op with your friends, just completely messing around with the game and seeing what kind of ridiculous mayhem you can cause, but you could say the same thing about literally any game out there that has co-op. It frankly doesn't matter how terrible a game is or how good a game is. If you're playing it with friends, it's always going to be more fun. So that's pretty much a non-factor here, and what it ultimately exposes is that the only real fun you're ever going to have with Ghost Recon Wildlands is just messing around with it in ways that it's not meant to be played, and that's mostly going to be with your friends. And once you get beyond that context, you just start playing it by yourself and actually trying to play it the way it's meant to be played, you find out that it is just 50 to 100 or more hours of filler content, and none of that filler content has even the slightest bit of depth whatsoever. And it just ends up being an overall absolutely terrible game. And to make matters even worse, it has a pretty tacked-on versus multiplayer mode that these days you can't even get into a match for. So what you're left with is a single-player experience that is absolutely miserable, and a co-op experience that frankly you could be having in just about any other game in existence that has a co-op mode. Because as amusing as tactical tractor infiltrations are the first time you do them, once you get past that ridiculousness, which is almost immediately, you're left with an extremely shallow experience that just amounts to a long sequence of mindless tedium at absolute best. And it just ends up being absolutely terrible overall. which of course puts it at a 1 out of 5 on my scale. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.